On October 26, 1597, Admiral Yi Sun-sin stood on the deck of his flagship with 9 warships against 130 Japanese vessels closing in for the kill. His nation had declared him a traitor. His fleet had been destroyed. He'd been tortured and stripped of rank. Now, with 9 ships and 330 men, he faced an armada that had conquered half of Korea. By sunset, the sea would run red with the blood of 13,000 Japanese sailors, and one man would prove that genius, geography, and sheer audacity could shatter mathematics itself. Think about those numbers for a second. 9 against 130. That's a 14-to-1 disadvantage. Yet by the end of this video, you'll understand how a disgraced admiral turned a narrow strait into a killing field and rewrote the rules of naval warfare forever. I'm about to reveal 3 things that will change how you see impossible odds. First, the death-defying gamble that convinced his own captains Yi had lost his mind. Second, why the deadliest weapon in the battle wasn't cannons or arrows. It was the sea itself. And third, the chilling moment when 31 Japanese warships tried to retreat and discovered they were trapped in a liquid grave. But here's what makes this truly unbelievable. How did Yi convince terrified captains not to flee when retreat meant survival? What split-second decision turned certain annihilation into total victory? Why did Japanese commanders beach their ships and commit suicide rather than face their shogun? How does one man hold back an entire invasion fleet for 6 hours with 9 wooden ships? To understand how 330 Koreans destroyed an empire's naval might, we need to go back to when Korea itself was on the verge of extinction. April 15th, 97. Admiral Yi Sun-sin knelt in a Seoul prison cell. His back shredded from 100 lashes, his body broken from weeks of torture. 6 months earlier, he'd commanded Korea's southern fleet, the only force standing between the Japanese invasion army and total conquest. He'd won every naval engagement he'd fought. 23 battles, 23 victories, 0 defeats. But a jealous rival had whispered poison in the king's ear, accusing Yi of treason and cowardice. The penalty was death. Yi's crime: refusing to sail his fleet into an obvious ambush that would have annihilated Korea's navy and handed Japan victory. Now, as he awaited execution, Japanese forces were sweeping north, burning everything in their path. The new admiral, the man who'd replaced Yi, had just led the Korean fleet into battle. It had been massacred. Of 165 Korean warships, only 12 survived. Think about that for a second. Korea's most successful military commander, a man who'd never lost a single engagement, was being tortured while the incompetent officer who destroyed the fleet in one afternoon was now dead, and Korea was defenseless. The torture had lasted 16 days. Court officials had wanted a confession that Yi had conspired with the Japanese, that his victories had been staged, that he deliberately let enemy forces escape. They waterboarded him. They suspended him from wooden frames and beat him with bamboo rods studded with metal barbs. They crushed his fingers in wooden presses. Yi Sun-sin, 52 years old, refused to confess to crimes he hadn't committed. The interrogators found this infuriating. Most men broke within hours. Yi lasted 2 weeks before the king, under pressure from officials who understood that executing your best admiral during an invasion was strategic suicide, commuted the sentence from execution to military demotion. Here's what makes this betrayal truly unbelievable. Yi had saved Korea, not metaphorically, literally. In 1592, when Japanese forces had conquered Seoul in 3 weeks and seemed unstoppable, Yi's fleet had severed their naval supply lines. Japanese armies, unable to receive food and ammunition by sea, had stalled. By 1593, Japan had been forced to negotiate a ceasefire. Not because they'd been defeated on land, but because Yi's navy had made continued operations impossible. For 5 years, Yi had bottled up the invasion, and his reward was torture and disgrace. The man who replaced him was Myeongnyang, a political admiral who'd spent more time at court than on ships. One had no tactical training, no naval experience, and a pathological hatred of Yi Sun-sin rooted in pure jealousy. When Wan took command of Korea's fleet in April 1597, he commanded 165 warships crewed by 15,000 sailors. It was the largest Korean naval force assembled in decades. Wan promptly led them into the Battle of Myeongnyang on July 15th, ignoring warnings about Japanese strength and treacherous currents. The battle lasted 4 hours. The massacre lasted 3. 153 Korean warships were destroyed. Myeongnyang died trying to flee. 13,000 Korean sailors drowned or burned to death. Let that sink in. Korea had gone from naval dominance to near extinction in 3 months because they'd replaced competence with politics. By August, Japanese commanders were openly discussing their final offensive. With Korea's navy destroyed, they could land armies anywhere on the southern coast. Seoul would fall within weeks. Total conquest was inevitable. But here's what the Japanese didn't know. In that Seoul prison cell, broken and disgraced, Yi Sun-sin was still alive. And King Seonjo, staring at reports of Myeongnyang's catastrophic defeat, was about to make the most desperate decision of his reign. He was going to ask the man he tortured to save the kingdom that had tried to execute him. To understand what Yi was facing, you need to understand what Japan had become by 1592. After a century of civil war, warlord Toyotomi Hideyoshi had unified Japan through conquest and terror. He controlled 300,000 samurai, battle-hardened warriors who'd spent their entire lives fighting. But peace was a problem. Hideyoshi had an army with nothing to kill, and unemployed samurai were dangerous. His solution was simple and terrifying. Invade Korea, then use it as a staging ground to conquer Ming China. The invasion force that landed at Busan on May 23, 1592, numbered 158,700 troops supported by 900 warships. Korea's standing army was 70,000, scattered across the peninsula, commanded by generals who hadn't fought a real war in 200 years. Within 3 weeks, Japanese forces had captured Seoul. Within 2 months, they controlled 2/3 of Korea. Think about those numbers. 158,000 hardened warriors who'd spent decades perfecting the art of killing, against 70,000 troops who'd spent their careers on parade grounds. This wasn't a war. It was an execution. The speed of the Japanese advance defied belief. On May 23rd, the first wave landed at Busan. The fortress commander, Yongbal, had 4,000 troops and stone walls that had stood for centuries. The walls fell in 12 hours. Yongbal committed suicide rather than face capture. By May 25th, 48 hours after landing, Japanese forces had captured Dongne Fortress. By June 1st, they'd taken Sangju. By June 12th, Seoul fell without a siege. King Seonjo fled north so fast, he abandoned the royal archives, the national treasury, and half his court. Japanese commanders couldn't believe how easy it was. They'd expected months of grinding siege warfare. Instead, Korean defenses collapsed like wet paper. Here's what made the Japanese so devastating. They'd perfected warfare through experience. For 100 years, Japan had been locked in the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period. Every daimyo had his own army. Every province was a battlefield. Samurai had been fighting since childhood. They knew tactics, logistics, siege warfare, naval operations. They'd invented matchlock arquebus tactics that could shred traditional armor. They fought with a combination of discipline and brutality that shocked Korean defenders. Korean generals, by contrast, had inherited their positions through aristocratic lineage, not merit. They commanded troops who drilled occasionally and had never seen real combat. When Japanese arquebuses opened fire, 300 firearms per regiment, firing in rotating volleys, Korean soldiers broke and ran. They'd never faced gunpowder weapons in formation. The sound alone was psychologically devastating. By July 1592, Japanese forces controlled everything south of the Imjin River. They'd captured Myeongnyang, the northern capital. They'd divided Korea into occupation zones. They'd established supply depots, fortified positions, and administrative centers. Korean resistance on land had effectively ceased to exist. Japanese commanders began drafting plans for the invasion of Ming China. Korea was supposed to be a speed bump. It had taken 7 weeks to conquer. But here's what the chronicles don't tell you. While Korean armies were collapsing on land, something impossible was happening at sea. A provincial admiral named Yi Sun-sin had just won his first naval engagement at Okpo on May 7th, destroying 26 Japanese warships without losing a single Korean vessel. Japanese commanders noticed but didn't worry. They controlled the land. That's what mattered. They were wrong. What Yi Sun-sin was about to do over the next 5 years would prove that controlling the sea meant controlling everything. And it would turn Japan's lightning conquest into a bleeding, grinding nightmare they couldn't escape. While Korean armies collapsed on land, one man was winning on water. Admiral Yi Sun-sin had taken command of the left Jeolla province fleet in February 1592, 3 months before the invasion. Unlike most Korean officers, Yi actually prepared for war. He drilled his crews relentlessly. He stockpiled ammunition and repaired ships others had written off as unseaworthy. And he built something no one had ever seen before. The Gyeobukseon, the turtle ship. Picture a Panoxion warship, Korea's standard battle vessel, but completely covered with a wooden deck studded with iron spikes and metal plates. The Japanese couldn't board it. Their signature tactic, flooding enemy ships with samurai warriors, was useless. The turtle ship had a dragon head mounted on the bow that spewed sulfur smoke to obscure visibility and terrify enemies. It bristled with cannons and arrow ports on all sides. It was a floating fortress designed for one purpose: ramming through enemy formations and tearing them apart from within. The specifications were terrifying. Each turtle ship measured roughly 100 feet long and 30 feet wide. The covered deck, the innovation that changed everything, was constructed from hexagonal wooden panels overlaid with iron spikes that protruded 6 to 8 inches upward. Any samurai trying to board would impale himself the moment he jumped. The iron plating made the deck resistant to fire arrows and arquebus rounds. Beneath this protective shell, 130 oarsmen powered the vessel, while 80 Marines operated the weapons. Think about that weaponry. 11 gun ports per side, 22 cannons total, 2 more in the bow, 2 in the stern, 26 artillery pieces on a single ship. For comparison, Japanese warships of the period carried 0 cannons. Their entire naval doctrine was built around ramming, grappling, and boarding. The turtle ship made that doctrine obsolete. here's where it gets genuinely insane. Yi didn't just build one. By May 15, 92, he'd constructed at least 3 turtle ships, possibly 5. Historical records conflict on the exact number. He'd done this despite having no royal authorization, no additional funding, and active opposition from court officials who thought he was wasting resources on experimental vessels. Yi had used his own salary, requisitioned local materials, and bullied provincial governors into providing timber and iron. He trained specialized crews for months on tactics no one had ever attempted. When Japanese forces landed at Busan and started their conquest, Yi's turtle ships were ready. The first combat deployment came at the Battle of Sacheon on May 29, 1592. Yi's fleet of 26 warships, including at least 1 turtle ship, encountered 12 Japanese vessels anchored near Sacheon Harbor. Japanese commanders watched the Korean fleet approach and prepared for standard boarding actions. Then, the turtle ship accelerated. It rammed straight through the Japanese formation, cannons firing from every port, the dragonhead spewing sulfur smoke that obscured vision and choked enemy crews. Japanese samurai tried to board. They couldn't. The iron spikes and continuous cannon fire kept them at distance, while Korean Marines fired arrows through the protected gun ports. The turtle ship circled through the enemy fleet like a shark through a school of fish, systematically destroying vessel after vessel. The battle lasted 3 hours. All 12 Japanese ships were sunk or burned. Korean casualties: 0 ships lost, 19 men wounded. Let that sink in. A weapon system so effective, it achieved total victory without sustaining a single loss. The Japanese had never seen anything like it, and they were about to see it 22 more times over the next 5 years, every single engagement ending in Korean victory. Yi Sun-sin had invented the weapon that would save his nation. Now he just had to prove it could win a war. From May through December 1592, Yi Sun-sin fought 23 naval engagements against Japanese forces. He won all of them. At the Battle of Okpo on May 7th, Yi's fleet destroyed 26 Japanese ships without losing a single Korean vessel. At Sacheon, he annihilated 13 enemy warships. At the Battle of Hansan Island in August, the naval engagement that saved Korea from conquest, Yi's fleet destroyed 59 Japanese ships and killed 9,000 Japanese sailors using tactics that wouldn't look out of place in modern naval doctrine. Yi understood something fundamental. Japanese naval tactics relied on boarding. Their ships were transport vessels designed to carry samurai close enough to jump onto enemy decks and fight hand-to-hand. Korean warships were artillery platforms built to sink enemies from a distance with cannons and fire arrows. Yi refused to fight on Japanese terms. He kept his distance, used superior Korean gunnery to smash enemy hulls, and retreated when the Japanese tried to close. It worked. By the end of 1592, Japan controlled most of Korea on land, but couldn't supply their armies by sea because Yi's fleet dominated the southern coastal waters. The numbers defied belief. 23 engagements, 344 Japanese warships destroyed, estimated Japanese naval casualties, over 30,000 killed or drowned. Korean losses: 0 ships sunk in combat, fewer than 100 casualties total. This wasn't warfare. It was systematic extermination. Here's what made Yi's victories so devastating. He didn't just win battles. He perfected a tactical system that made defeat impossible. At Hansan Island on August 14, 1592, Yi faced 73 Japanese warships commanded by Wakisaka Yasuharu, one of Hideyoshi's most aggressive naval officers. Wakisaka saw Yi's fleet of 56 ships approaching and ordered an immediate attack, confident that samurai boarding tactics would overwhelm the Koreans. Yi retreated. The Japanese pursued, their formation breaking apart as faster ships pulled ahead, chasing what they thought was a fleeing enemy. Yi lured them into open water, then executed what Korean naval archives call the Hakik Jin. His fleet suddenly wheeled around in a massive crescent shape, with turtle ships at the center and Panoxion warships forming the wings. The Japanese found themselves surrounded in a killing pocket. Think about what happened next. Yi's ships opened fire simultaneously from 3 sides. Cannons and fire arrows poured into the trapped Japanese vessels at ranges where boarding was impossible. Japanese crews tried to turn, to close the distance, to do anything that would let them fight the way they'd been trained. Korean ships simply adjusted position, maintaining optimal firing range while the crescent tightened. It was naval warfare as execution. The battle lasted 7 hours. 59 Japanese ships were destroyed. 9,000 Japanese sailors died. Not a single Korean vessel was lost. Japanese commanders began to fear Yi Sun-sin the way medieval Europe had feared the Mongols, as an unstoppable force of nature. Contemporary Japanese records describe him in supernatural terms. One chronicle called him, quote, one another, wrote that, and are, quote, two. They weren't exaggerating. Every supply convoy that tried to run Yi's blockade was destroyed. Every attempt to reinforce Japanese armies by sea ended in catastrophe. By December 1592, Japanese forces occupying Korea were starving. They controlled the land, but couldn't hold it because Yi controlled the water. Here's what the Japanese didn't understand. Yi wasn't just winning battles. He was strangling an invasion. Every destroyed supply ship meant less food for Japanese armies. Every sunk troop transport meant no reinforcements. By the end of 1592, 158,000 Japanese soldiers were trapped in a country they'd conquered but couldn't supply. And it was all because one admiral refused to lose. But success breeds enemies. And the deadliest enemy Yi Sun-sin would face wasn't Japanese, it was Korean. Success made Yi enemies. Won-gyun was a high-ranking Korean naval officer who despised Yi Sun-sin with pathological intensity. One had connections at court, Yi did not. One whispered constantly that Yi was too cautious, that he refused to attack when opportunities arose, that his victories were exaggerated. King Seonjo, desperate for good news, wanted to believe that aggressive action could turn the war around. In April 1597, Won-gyun convinced the king that Yi Sun-sin had deliberately disobeyed orders to attack a Japanese position. The accusation was false. The order itself had been a trap designed by a Japanese spy to lure the Korean fleet into an ambush. But Yi couldn't prove it. He was arrested, brought to Seoul in chains, tortured for weeks, and sentenced to death. Only intervention by high-ranking officials who understood Yi's strategic importance saved his life. Instead of execution, Yi was stripped of rank and sent to serve as a common foot soldier under General Gwon-yul. Won-gyun was promoted to Supreme Naval Commander and given control of Korea's entire remaining fleet. Here's what made Won-gyun so dangerous. He wasn't stupid. He was incompetent in battle but brilliant at court politics. One came from a powerful aristocratic family with direct access to King Seonjo. Yi Sun-sin was provincial gentry, capable, loyal, but with zero political connections. One had been jealous of Yi since 1592, when Yi's victories made him a national hero. Every time Yi destroyed a Japanese fleet, Wan seethed. Every commendation Yi received felt like a personal insult. By 1597, Wan's jealousy had metastasized into obsession. The trap came in February 1597. A Japanese defector, actually a double agent, brought intelligence to the Korean court claiming that the Japanese commander Kato Yoshiaki would be sailing through a specific strait on a specific date with minimal protection. The defector urged immediate attack. King Seonjo, seeing an opportunity to capture a major enemy leader, ordered Yi to attack. Yi read the intelligence and immediately recognized it as bait. The timing was too convenient, the route too predictable, the defector too eager. Yi sent back a detailed report explaining why the intelligence was false and why an attack would sail directly into an ambush. He refused the order. Won-gyun saw his opportunity. He presented Yi's refusal to the king as cowardice and insubordination. Admiral Yi has 23 victories, but refuses to pursue the enemy to total. Destruction, Won argued. He sits in harbor while Japanese forces rebuild. His caution borders on collaboration. The accusation was insane. Yi had destroyed 344 enemy warships. But King Seonjo, frustrated by the stalemate on land, wanted to believe someone could be more aggressive than Yi. On April 1st, 1597, royal guards arrested Yi Sun-sin at his headquarters and dragged him to Seoul in chains. The torture began April 4th. Court officials wanted a confession. They got nothing. Yi endured 16 days of systematic brutality and never admitted to treason because he hadn't committed it. Think about that. Korea's greatest military commander was being tortured while Japanese forces prepared their next offensive. The irony was grotesque. King Seonjo finally commuted the death sentence after officials, including Chief State Councilor Ryu Seong-ryong, argued that executing Yi during wartime was strategic suicide. Instead, Yi was demoted to common soldier and sent north. Won-gyun was given command of 165 warships. The fleet Yi had spent 5 years building into an unstoppable force. Won-gyun had exactly what he wanted. Supreme command, the largest Korean fleet ever assembled, and the chance to prove he was better than Yi Sun-sin. He had 3 months before his incompetence would kill 13,000 Korean sailors and destroy everything Yi had built. The countdown to catastrophe had begun. Won-gyun was a disaster. He was arrogant, impulsive, and tactically incompetent. On July 15, 1597, Won led the Korean fleet, 165 warships, into battle against a Japanese naval force near Chilcheonryang. He ignored scouting reports. He disregarded the treacherous currents. He ordered a frontal assault against a numerically superior, well-positioned enemy in narrow waters where Korean ships couldn't maneuver. It was a slaughter. Japanese forces surrounded the Korean fleet and tore it apart. Ship after ship was boarded, burned, or sunk. Korean sailors drowned by the thousands. Won-gyun himself was killed trying to escape. By the time surviving ships limped away, Korea had lost 153 warships. Only 12 remained. The southern coast was now wide open. Japanese forces could land wherever they wanted. The invasion that Yi Sun-sin had bottled up for 5 years was about to overwhelm the peninsula. Think about what Won did in 3 months. Yi Sun-sin had commanded Korea's southern fleet for 5 years, fought 23 battles, and never lost a single ship to enemy action. Won-gyun commanded the fleet for 90 days and destroyed 93% of it in one afternoon. Here's what makes the disaster so inexcusable. Won had every advantage. He commanded 165 warships, more than Yi ever had. His crews were experienced, trained by Yi himself. He had adequate supplies, functioning cannons, and detailed intelligence about Japanese positions. Korean scouts had reported that Japanese forces were consolidating at Chilcheonryang, that enemy numbers were substantial, and that the narrow strait would negate Korean advantages in artillery and maneuver. One ignored all of it. On the morning of July 15th, One ordered the entire fleet to sail into Myeongnyang Strait and attack whatever they found. No reconnaissance, no tactical planning, no consideration of currents, wind, or positioning. The fleet sailed in a loose, disorganized column, exactly the formation Yi Sun-sin would never use because it was vulnerable to envelopment. Japanese commanders, watching from elevated positions, couldn't believe their luck. The Korean fleet was sailing directly into a killing zone. The Japanese had 500 warships waiting in ambush, hidden in coves, behind islands, positioned to strike from multiple directions simultaneously. When the Korean fleet entered the strait, Japanese vessels emerged and attacked from the front, both flanks and the rear. One's ships, packed into narrow waters with no room to maneuver, became targets. Japanese boarding tactics, useless against Yi's disciplined formations, worked perfectly against Wan's chaos. Samurai swarmed onto Korean decks. Ships collided with each other trying to escape. Captains abandoned formation and fled individually, turning retreat into rout. Myeongnyang, watching his fleet disintegrate, panicked. He ordered his flagship to retreat, abandoning his own ships to their fate. Japanese forces pursued. One made it to shore and tried to flee on foot. He was caught and killed by Japanese soldiers who didn't even realize they'd just executed Korea's supreme naval commander. His body was found 3 days later in a ditch. The butcher's bill was catastrophic. 153 Korean warships destroyed or captured. Approximately 13,000 Korean sailors killed, drowned, or taken prisoner. The survivors, 12 damaged ships carrying maybe 2,000 men, scattered north in complete disarray. Let that sink in. In 5 hours, Myeongnyang had undone 5 years of Yi Sun-sin's work. Japanese commanders immediately understood what this meant. With Korea's navy destroyed, they could land armies anywhere on the southern coast. Supply lines that Yi had severed could now operate freely. The invasion that had stalled in 1593 could resume. Orders went out. Prepare for the final offensive. Seoul would fall by autumn. Total conquest was now inevitable. But there was one problem the Japanese didn't know about yet. Yi Sun-sin was still alive, and he was about to be given command of 12 ships and told to save a kingdom. August 3rd, 1597. King Seonjo summoned Yi Sun-sin to Seoul and made him supreme naval commander again. The irony was crushing. Yi had been tortured for refusing to sacrifice the fleet, and now he was being ordered to save a navy that no longer existed. Court officials recommended disbanding what remained of Korea's naval forces and integrating the sailors into land armies. Yi Sun-sin refused. Quote 5. He reportedly said. Quote 6. By the time Yi reached his new command post, the situation had deteriorated further. 3 more ships had been lost or declared unseaworthy. When Yi raised his flag over the surviving fleet on September 16, 1597, he commanded exactly 9 warships and 330 men. Korean spies reported that Japanese commanders were assembling a massive fleet to sail north and link up with land forces advancing toward Seoul. The Japanese armada numbered 130 warships, carrying at least 10,000 soldiers. Yi's officers begged him to retreat north, abandon the southern coast, and preserve what little remained of the navy. Yi's response became legendary. Quote 7. Think about those numbers. 9 ships against 130, a 14-to-1 disadvantage. 330 Korean sailors facing 10,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors. By every rational military calculation, Yi should have disbanded the fleet, retreated to Seoul, and accepted that Korea's naval defense was finished. Instead, he declared he would fight. His officers thought he'd lost his mind. Captain An Wi, commander of one of the 9 remaining ships, confronted Yi directly on September 17th. Quote 8. Other captains agreed. Some suggested scuttling the ships rather than letting them fall into Japanese hands. The consensus was unanimous. Retreat was the only logical option. Yi Sun-sin listened to every argument. Then he gave an order that revealed why he was the greatest naval commander of his age. Quote 9. The captain stared at him like he'd started speaking in tongues. Myeongnyang Strait? The narrow channel between Jindo Island and the mainland? The place with currents so violent that merchant ships avoided it even in peacetime. Yi wanted to fight the decisive naval battle there. Here's what Yi understood that his officers didn't. Numbers meant nothing if the enemy couldn't bring them to bear. In open water, 130 Japanese ships would surround and overwhelm 9 Korean vessels in minutes. But in a strait barely 300 yards wide at its narrowest point, only a handful of ships could attack simultaneously. The Japanese numerical advantage would be neutralized by geography. Even better, the Myeongnyang Strait had something else, the most powerful tidal current in Korean waters. Twice daily, millions of tons of seawater forced through that narrow channel at speeds exceeding 10 knots. Ships caught in the current weren't sailing. They were being swept along by liquid force that could smash hulls against rocks or spin vessels completely out of control. Yi had studied those currents for years. He knew exactly when they turned. He knew which parts of the strait had the strongest flow and which had eddies where ships could hold position. He knew something else too. Japanese commanders had probably never sailed through Myeongnyang. They didn't know the water. They didn't understand the danger. And that ignorance was going to kill them. On September 25th, Yi ordered his 9 ships to sail for Myeongnyang Strait. His captains followed, convinced they were sailing toward death. They were wrong. They were sailing toward the most impossible naval victory in human history. Yi Sun-sin chose his battlefield with terrifying precision. The Myeongnyang Strait, a narrow channel of water separating Jindo Island from the mainland. The strait was barely 900 feet wide at its narrowest point. That alone was tactically significant. Japanese numerical superiority meant nothing if only a few ships could attack at once. But the real weapon was invisible. The current. Twice daily, the tide turned in the Myeongnyang Strait, creating one of the most powerful tidal flows in the world. At peak velocity, the current could reach 11 knots, faster than most 16th century warships could row. When the tide turned, ships caught in the strait weren't sailing anymore. They were being swept along by a liquid avalanche moving at 13 miles per hour. Yi studied the tidal charts. He knew exactly when the current would reverse. He knew that if he could hold his position until the turn, the sea itself would become his ally. Think about the physics involved. The Yellow Sea on one side, the Korea Strait on the other, and between them this narrow bottleneck. Every 6 hours, the tide shifted, forcing millions of tons of water through a channel 300 yards wide. The volume of water moving through that strait during tidal change was equivalent to a river flowing at flood stage. Ships trying to sail against it weren't just fighting current. They were fighting hydrodynamic force that could snap oars, tear sails, and spin multi-ton vessels like toys in a bathtub. Here's what made Yi's plan genuinely insane. The tidal window was narrow. The current reached maximum velocity for approximately 30 minutes during the turn. Before that, it was manageable. After that, it weakened. Yi needed to time the battle so that he engaged the Japanese fleet during that exact 30-minute window when the current was strongest. Early, and he'd face overwhelming numbers without the current's help. Late, and the Japanese could maneuver normally. The margin for error was 0. Yi had reconnaissance teams map the strait's geography down to the meter. They measured depths, marked underwater rocks, identified eddies where ships could hold position against the current. They noted that the northern end of the strait, where Yi planned to anchor his fleet, had a natural eddy created by Jindo Island's coastline. Ships positioned there could maintain formation, while the main channel became a death trap. The Japanese, sailing through for the first time, would know none of this. They'd enter the strait assuming it was just narrow water. By the time they realized the current was deadly, they'd be trapped in it. On October 25th, Yi positioned his 9 ships at the northern mouth of the strait in a defensive arc. Behind them was open water leading to the Korean interior. In front of them, the strait narrowed into the killing zone. Yi calculated the tidal schedule. The current would reverse at approximately 11:30 a.m. on October 26th. That meant he needed to hold his position for roughly 90 minutes after the Japanese attack began. 90 minutes of fighting against 14-to-1 odds before physics took over and turned the battle. His captains understood the plan and hated it. "Admiral," one reportedly said, "this requires perfect timing. If the Japanese break through before the tide turns, we're finished. If we misjudge the current, we'll be swept away with them." Yi's response was simple. Quote, 12, October 26th, 1597. The day when 9 ships would face 130, when 330 men would hold the line against 10,000, and when the sea would prove that the greatest weapon in naval warfare isn't cannons or ships. It's knowing exactly when the tide turns. Dawn, October 26th, 1597. Yi's 9 ships anchored at the northern end of the Myeongnyang Strait in a defensive line. Behind them was open water leading to the Korean heartland. In front of them, the strait narrowed into a bottleneck. Beyond that, somewhere in the morning mist, 130 Japanese warships were approaching. Yi's captains were terrified. One of them, Ennui, confronted Yi directly. Quote 13. Yi Sun-sin's response, recorded by multiple witnesses, was delivered in a voice that allowed no argument. "It is easy to die. It is hard to live. Those who seek death will live, and those who seek life will die. If even one of you shows fear, if one ship breaks formation and flees, I will personally execute you. We will stand here. We will fight here. And if the heavens will it, we will die here, but we will not run." The captains returned to their ships in silence. What do you tell your crew when their admiral has just promised to execute anyone who retreats? How do you prepare 330 men to face 10,000 when survival means staying in formation while every instinct screams to flee? Yi's flagship occupied the center position. On his left, 4 Panoxion warships spread in a defensive arc. On his right, 4 more. Each ship carried approximately 37 men. Sailors, marines, gunners. The math was brutal. 9 ships, 330 men total, approximately 20 cannons per vessel, against 130 Japanese warships carrying at least 10,000 soldiers and sailors. The Korean crews checked their weapons obsessively. Loaded and reloaded cannons, sharpened blades, prayed to ancestors and gods. Some wrote final letters to families they'd never see again. Here's what made the waiting unbearable. They could hear the Japanese fleet before they could see it. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, the sound reached them. Drums. Thousands of drums beating in rhythm across the water, echoing off the strait's rocky walls. It was psychological warfare. The sound of an approaching tsunami. Korean sailors gripped their weapons tighter. Some vomited over the rails from pure terror. Officers walked the decks, forcing men to breathe, to focus, to stay at their posts. At approximately 9:45 a.m., the mist began to lift, and the horizon turned black with sails. Contemporary accounts describe the sight in apocalyptic terms. 130 warships advancing in formation, their oars churning the water in perfect synchronization, banners streaming, the morning sun glinting off armor and weapons. The Japanese vanguard alone, 31 ships sailing in attack formation, outnumbered Yi's entire fleet 3-1. On Yi's flagship, an officer whispered, quote, 15 Yi Sun-sin stood at the bow, watching the armada approach, his face expressionless. He'd calculated everything: the current, the timing, the geography. But numbers were numbers. If even one element failed, if the tide turned late, if his captains broke formation, Korea would lose its last 9 warships and the war would be over. The Japanese fleet kept coming. Distance closed. 500 yards. 400. 300. Korean sailors could see individual faces on enemy ships now. Could see samurai preparing grappling hooks and boarding weapons. Could see the sheer mass of ships that was about to crash over them like a wave. At 250 yards, Yi raised his hand. Every Korean gun crew tensed. The Japanese were entering cannon range, 130 ships bearing down on 9. In the next 60 seconds, the battle would begin, and history would witness something that shouldn't have been possible. At approximately 10 o'clock in the morning, the Japanese fleet appeared. Eyewitness accounts describe a sea of sails stretching from horizon to horizon. Contemporary Japanese records indicate the fleet was commanded by Kurushima Michifusa, Todo Takatora, and Kato Yoshiaki, 3 of Japan's most experienced naval commanders. They saw 9 Korean ships waiting at the mouth of the strait, and must have believed they were witnessing the end of organized Korean naval resistance. This would be a massacre. Japanese ships surged forward into the narrow channel, warships packed side by side, oars churning the water. The first wave, approximately 31 ships, entered the strait at ramming speed, crews already preparing grappling hooks and boarding weapons. Yi Sun-sin did not move. His flagship, the massive Panoxion at the center of the Korean line, sat motionless. The other 8 ships held position, and the Japanese kept coming, funneling into the bottleneck where 900 feet of water was about to become their tomb. Kurushima Michifusa commanded the vanguard. He was a veteran of dozens of naval engagements, a samurai who'd fought in the original 1592 invasion. He'd seen Korean resistance collapse under Japanese boarding tactics again and again. 9 ships against 31. The battle would be over in minutes. He gave the order, full speed ahead, close the distance, board and overwhelm them before they can retreat. Here's what Kurushima didn't understand. Yi wasn't planning to retreat. He was planning to hold for exactly 90 minutes. Until 11:30 a.m., when the tide would reverse and the strait would transform from water into weapon. The Japanese had no idea. They saw 9 stationary targets and assumed fear had paralyzed them. At 10:15 a.m., the distance closed to 150 yards. The Japanese vanguard filled the strait, 31 ships packed so tightly their oars nearly touched. They were advancing at maximum speed, momentum carrying them forward in a solid wall of wood and steel. Korean gun crews watched them come, fingers on slow matches, waiting for Yi's signal. At 100 yards, Yi Sun-sin's hand dropped. Every Korean cannon fired simultaneously. The sound was like thunder contained in a stone corridor. 18 ships, 20 cannons each, 360 pieces of artillery discharging chain shot and iron balls into a target they literally couldn't miss. The front rank of Japanese ships disintegrated. Hulls shattered. Masts toppled. Men screamed. But the ships behind them couldn't stop. Momentum and the press of vessels from behind drove them forward into the killing zone. Korean gun crews reloaded with practiced speed. 15 seconds per reload. Fire. Reload. Fire. Continuous artillery bombardment at point-blank range into a mass of ships that had nowhere to maneuver. Japanese boarding tactics required closing with the enemy. But Korean gunnery kept them at deadly distance. Every time a Japanese ship tried to surge forward, cannon fire smashed it backward or tore holes in its hull. Think about what was happening. 31 Japanese warships, carrying over 3,000 soldiers, were being systematically destroyed by 9 Korean vessels, because geography had neutralized every tactical advantage Japan possessed. The narrow strait meant the Japanese couldn't surround the Koreans. The defensive position meant Koreans could fire without moving. And the Japanese, committed to their charge, couldn't retreat because 99 more ships were pushing from behind. At 10:45 a.m., 45 minutes into the battle, 15 Japanese ships were sinking or on fire. But Yi's captains were beginning to panic. They'd been fighting for 3/4 of an hour. Ammunition was running low. Casualties were mounting, and the tide hadn't turned yet. What if Yi had miscalculated? What if the current came late? Then something happened that nearly ended the battle before physics could intervene. The Korean line broke. Here's where it gets genuinely insane. As the Japanese vanguard closed to within cannon range, the Korean line began to waver. One ship started turning, then another. Yi's captains, staring at 31 enemy vessels bearing down on them, broke. They began to retreat. Yi Sun-sin found himself alone. His flagship faced 31 Japanese warships by itself. Every tactical manual ever written says what happens next. The lone ship is swarmed, boarded, and overwhelmed. Its commander dies, his fleet scatters, the battle is over. Yi Sun-sin ordered his ship forward. He sailed directly into the Japanese fleet. His cannons opened fire at point-blank range. Chain shot and iron balls smashing into wooden hulls. His archers rained fire arrows onto enemy decks. The Japanese tried to surround him, but in the narrow strait, they got in each other's way. Ships collided, oars tangled. And Yi's flagship, maneuvering with impossible precision, stayed just ahead of the boarding attempts, while its guns systematically destroyed one ship after another. It happened at 10:52 a.m. Captain An Wei's ship turned first, oars pulling backward, breaking formation. Then Kim Yok-chu's vessel followed. Then 2 more. The captains had cracked. They'd been fighting for nearly an hour, watching Japanese ships keep coming despite catastrophic losses. And terror finally overwhelmed discipline. Within 90 seconds, 8 of Yi's 9 ships were retreating north out of the strait. Yi Sun-sin stood alone. His flagship, 110 feet of wood and iron carrying 37 men, faced 31 enemy warships mounting over 3,000 soldiers. Think about that. One ship, 31 enemies. The mathematical probability of survival was effectively 0. Japanese commanders saw Yi's isolation and committed everything to destroying him. This was the moment. Kill the Korean admiral, scatter his fleet, win the battle. Yi gave an order that defied every tactical principle: advance. His flagship surged forward into the mass of Japanese vessels. Oarsmen pulled with desperate strength. Gun crews fired cannons as fast as they could reload. Left broadside, right broadside, bow guns, stern guns, a continuous rolling thunder of artillery that turned the water between ships into chaos. But here's what made Yi's maneuver tactically brilliant rather than suicidal. The strait was too narrow for the Japanese to effectively surround him. When 6 or 7 enemy ships tried to converge on Yi's flagship simultaneously, they got in each other's way. Hulls scraped, oars locked. Ships trying to grapple Yi ended up grappling each other. Yi exploited the confusion with terrifying skill. He kept his ship moving in tight circles, using the eddy current near Jindo Island to maintain position, while forcing Japanese vessels into the main channel where the current was stronger. His gunners fired into enemy ships at ranges measured in yards. Chain shot, 2 iron balls connected by a chain, tore through rigging and snapped masts. Solid shot punched through hulls at the waterline. Fire arrows turned wooden decks into infernos. At 11:03 a.m., Kurushima Michifusa's flagship closed to boarding range. Japanese samurai prepared to jump. Yi's archers cut them down before they could leap. Kurushima himself, standing at the bow directing the attack, took an arrow through the throat. He fell backward into his own ship, blood pouring from the wound. He was dead within minutes. The Japanese vanguard's commander, killed by a shot from a ship he outnumbered 31-1. But Yi couldn't hold forever. His ammunition was running critically low. His crew was exhausted. Japanese ships were adjusting their tactics, learning to coordinate their attacks. At 11:10 a.m., 3 Japanese vessels converged simultaneously on Yi's flagship from different angles. This was it. The moment Yi's ship would be overwhelmed. Then a voice cut across the water. Yi's son, Yi Ho, commanding one of the retreating vessels. He was screaming at the fleeing captains, quote, 16. His ship turned. Oars bit water. He was sailing back into the battle. Then Kim Yok-chu's ship followed. Then another. Then all of them. 8 Korean warships that had fled in terror now returning because watching their admiral fight alone was more unbearable than facing death. At 11:14 a.m., the Korean line reformed. 9 ships against 31. But now the Japanese vanguard was disorganized, damaged, and leaderless. And the clock was ticking toward 11:30, 16 minutes until the tide turned and physics joined the battle. The Korean captains, watching from behind, saw something that shouldn't have been possible. Yi's flagship wasn't dying. It was fighting, and it was winning. His son, Yi Ho, reportedly shouted to the fleeing ships, quote, 17 one by one, the Korean ships turned back. First, the vessel commanded by Kim Yok-chu. Then An Wi's ship, the same captain who'd begged to retreat hours earlier. Then the rest. All 9 ships reformed their line and crashed into the Japanese vanguard like a hammer. The battle exploded. At this range, Korean gunnery superiority was devastating. Cannons firing from multiple angles shredded Japanese ships. Flaming arrows turned wooden decks into infernos. The Japanese tried to board, but Korean archers cut them down the moment they came into range. And the strait was so narrow that Japanese reinforcements couldn't advance. Their own lead ships, now burning or sinking, blocked the channel. The transformation was instantaneous. At 11:15 a.m., the Korean fleet had been fleeing in disorder. By 11:17 a.m., they'd reformed into a coordinated battle line and were systematically destroying the Japanese vanguard. What changed wasn't the odds. Still 31 ships against 9. What changed was psychology. The captains had watched Yi Sun-sin sail alone into impossible odds and survive. If he could do that, they could stand beside him. Here's where Korean tactical superiority became absolutely crushing. With 9 ships working in coordination, Yi could execute the tactics he'd perfected over 5 years of warfare. The Korean line formed a shallow crescent, each ship positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Japanese vessels trying to close with one Korean ship would be hit by cannons from 2 or 3 others simultaneously. It was crossfire perfected. The strait's geography made it lethal. Japanese ships couldn't spread out to flank the Koreans. The channel was too narrow. They couldn't retreat. Their own reinforcements blocked escape. They could only push forward into concentrated artillery fire. At 11:21 a.m., the Japanese vanguard's losses reached critical mass. Of the original 31 ships, 19 were sinking, burning, or so badly damaged they were combat ineffective. Bodies floated in the water. Debris choked the strait. The survivors tried desperately to break through the Korean line, but every attempt was met with devastating firepower. One Japanese ship, its deck crowded with samurai preparing to board, took a direct cannon hit below the waterline. The hull split open. The ship went down in less than 2 minutes, taking everyone aboard with it. Think about those numbers. In 70 minutes of fighting, the Korean fleet had destroyed or disabled 19 enemy warships while sustaining moderate damage to 2 vessels and losing fewer than 30 men. The kill ratio was absurd. But Yi's ammunition was nearly exhausted. Gun crews were down to their last barrels of powder. Arrows were running out. The Korean line could hold for maybe another 15 minutes before they'd be reduced to ramming and hand-to-hand combat. Exactly the kind of fight where Japanese numerical superiority would be decisive. Yi Sun-sin checked the water. He'd been watching the current obsessively throughout the battle, measuring its strength by observing debris flow. At 11:26 a.m., he saw what he'd been waiting for. The water's movement was slowing. Eddies were forming differently. Small whirlpools appeared near the rocky outcrops. The tide was about to turn. 4 minutes. Yi needed to hold for 4 more minutes. Then the sea would finish what his cannons had started. But 4 minutes is an eternity in combat. And the Japanese, sensing desperation in the Korean fire rate, were preparing one final massive push. At 11:28 a.m., the remaining Japanese vanguard ships, 12 vessels still combat capable, charged simultaneously. This was all or nothing. Break through now or die trying. And Yi Sun-sin, watching them come, smiled. They had 2 minutes left to live and didn't know it yet. Yi Sun-sin had timed everything around a single calculation. The tide would turn at approximately 11:30 a.m. He'd been fighting for an hour and a half, holding his position at the strait's mouth, letting the Japanese pack more ships into the narrow channel. Now the moment arrived. The current reversed. Suddenly, Japanese ships weren't advancing anymore. They were being pushed backward by a current moving at 11 knots. Oarsmen strained against the flow. It didn't matter. The water was stronger. Ships spun. Formations disintegrated. And Yi's fleet, positioned where the current was weakest, pressed forward into the chaos. What followed was systematic slaughter. Japanese warships, unable to maneuver, became floating targets. Korean cannons fired at leisure, each shot smashing into hulls packed with soldiers. Ships capsized. Others collided with each other, shattering their own hulls. Men leaped into the water and were swept away by the current or dragged under by their armor. The Japanese commander, Kurushima Michifusa, tried desperately to rally his forces. He was killed by an arrow through the throat. 11:32 a.m. The tidal reversal reached full strength. Think about what this means in physical terms. Millions of tons of seawater compressed through a 900-foot-wide channel, moving at 13 miles per hour. That's faster than most humans can run. Japanese oarsmen, already exhausted from 90 minutes of combat, pulled desperately against the current. Their oars bent. Some snapped. The ships moved backward anyway, dragged by hydrodynamic force that human strength couldn't overcome. Here's where it gets genuinely catastrophic. Japanese warships began colliding with each other. A vessel trying to hold position would be struck from behind by another ship being swept backward. Hulls splintered, masts toppled. Ships locked together in tangled masses of wood and rigging. Then both vessels would capsize or be driven onto rocks. The strait's geography, which had trapped the Japanese in a killing zone, now became a drowning pool. At 11:35 a.m., 3 Japanese ships struck the rocky outcrop on the strait's western side simultaneously. The impacts were audible across the water, wood shattering, men screaming. One ship rolled completely over, dumping its entire crew into the current. Samurai in full armor sank like stones. Those without armor were swept south through the strait at speeds that slammed them into rocks or other vessels. The water turned red. Korean gun crews, conserving their last ammunition for nearly an hour, now fired with methodical precision. They didn't need to aim carefully anymore. The Japanese ships were stationary targets, spinning helplessly in the current. Every shot hit. Cannonballs punched through hulls already weakened by earlier damage. Ships that had survived the first phase of battle now went down in minutes, flooding through multiple breaches. By 11:45 a.m., 15 minutes after the tide turned, 23 Japanese ships had been completely destroyed. Let that sink in. 23 warships and approximately 2,300 men gone in a quarter hour. Not because of combat, but because Yi Sun-sin had turned physics itself into a weapon. The remaining Japanese vessels in the vanguard, 8 ships still afloat but catastrophically damaged, tried desperately to retreat south through the strait. They couldn't. The current was pushing them north toward the Korean guns. They couldn't advance. Korean artillery made that suicidal. They were trapped in liquid hell. Yi Sun-sin, watching the carnage unfold exactly as he'd calculated, gave a new order. Advance. The Korean fleet moved forward into the strait, pressing the attack while the current gave them positional advantage. Japanese ships attempting to flee were caught between Korean guns and the reversing tide. One by one, they went down. At 11:53 a.m., the last ship from the original 31-vessel Vanguard capsized and sank. 31 Japanese warships had entered the Myeongnyang Strait. 0 survived. But 99 more Japanese ships were still south of the strait, watching in horror as their vanguard was annihilated. And they had a choice to make: retreat and admit defeat, or sail into the same nightmare that had just killed 3,000 of their comrades. The 31 Japanese ships that had entered the strait found themselves trapped. Behind them, the current was too strong to row against. Ahead, Yi's ships blocked the exit. On both sides, the shore was too close. Running aground meant abandoning the ship and facing Korean ground forces waiting with spears and arrows. They tried to fight their way through. It was hopeless. One by one, Japanese warships were destroyed. Some burned, Some sank outright from cannon damage. Others capsized in the violent current. By noon, 23 of the original 31 ships had been completely destroyed. The remaining 8 were so badly damaged they were barely afloat. Japanese casualties were catastrophic. Thousands of sailors and soldiers drowned. Others burned to death, trapped below decks. The water around the Korean fleet turned red. Here's what made the trap so perfect. Every escape route violated basic physics or tactics. Japanese captains tried rowing south against the current. Their crews pulled until oars snapped and men collapsed from exhaustion. The ships moved backward anyway. They tried beaching on Jindo Island's rocky shore. Korean militia, farmers and civilians armed with spears, bows, and farming tools, were waiting. Any Japanese sailor who made it to shore was immediately cut down or driven back into the water. One Japanese commander attempted something desperate. At 11:58 a.m., he ordered his ship to ram directly through the Korean line, hoping speed and momentum would create a breach his surviving vessels could exploit. The ship accelerated. Oarsmen pulling in synchronized desperation, aiming for the gap between Yi's flagship and the vessel to its left. Korean gun crews tracked the approach. At 30 yards, they fired. Chain shot tore through the ship's rigging. The mast toppled forward, crushing men on the foredeck. Solid shot punched through the hull at the waterline. The ship didn't stop. Momentum carried it forward another 20 yards before it began sinking bow first. It went down in less than 90 seconds, stern rising vertically out of the water before sliding beneath the surface. Think about the casualties mounting in real time. Each Japanese warship carried approximately 100 men, sailors, soldiers, officers. 23 ships destroyed meant 2,300 men dead or drowning. Most wore some form of armor. Light or heavy, it didn't matter. Metal and leather became weight that pulled them under. The lucky ones drowned quickly. Others thrashed in the current, screaming for help that wouldn't come, until exhaustion or cold claimed them. By 12:15 p.m., the 8 surviving ships from the vanguard were barely functional. Hulls riddled with cannon holes, rigging shredded, crews decimated. One vessel was so badly damaged it could only drift with the current. Another was on fire, crew abandoning ship rather than burning alive. Korean Marines watched Japanese sailors leap into the water and get swept south through the strait, their heads visible for a few seconds before disappearing beneath the surface. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Some Japanese officers committed seppuku rather than face capture or drowning. Contemporary Korean accounts describe seeing samurai on sinking ships performing ritual suicide while water rose around them. They chose controlled death over chaos. Their bodies went down with their vessels. At 12:23 p.m., the last intact ship from the vanguard struck rocks on the eastern shore. The impact tore the bottom out of the hull. The ship settled into shallow water, listing badly, half submerged. Surviving crew members waded to shore and tried to flee inland. Korean ground forces hunted them down. 31 ships had entered the Myeongnyang Strait between 10 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. By 12:30 p.m., all 31 had been destroyed. Casualty estimate, 3,100 Japanese dead. Korean losses, 2 ships moderately damaged, 34 men killed or wounded. The kill ratio was 90-1, but 99 Japanese ships still waited south of the strait, and their commanders, watching through telescopes, had just witnessed 3 hours of systematic annihilation. Now they had to decide: attack through the same death trap or retreat and face their shogun's wrath for abandoning the invasion. The remaining Japanese fleet, watching from the strait's southern end, had seen enough. Approximately 99 Japanese warships turned and retreated in complete disorder. Commanders who'd entered the battle expecting an easy victory were now fleeing for their lives. The psychological impact was total. These were the same forces that had conquered half of Korea, that had won dozens of naval engagements, that had believed themselves invincible. 9 Korean ships had just destroyed 31 Japanese vessels and turned back an armada 14 times their size. Todo Takatora and Kato Yoshiaki, the surviving Japanese commanders, didn't stop retreating until they'd put 50 miles between themselves and the Myeongnyang Strait. Contemporary Japanese records describe the defeat in terms usually reserved for natural disasters. An earthquake, a tsunami, an act of God. The retreat began at approximately 12:40 p.m. It wasn't an organized withdrawal. It was a rout. Ships turned individually, without orders, crews making independent decisions to flee. Captains who'd sailed confidently toward Myeongnyang that morning now ordered maximum speed in the opposite direction. Oars churned water. Sails caught wind. The fleet scattered south in complete disarray, abandoning formation, abandoning coordination, abandoning any pretense of military discipline. Here's what makes this retreat so psychologically devastating. These were veteran commanders. Todo Takatora had participated in naval battles since the 1580s. Kato Yoshiaki had commanded ships during the original 1592 invasion. They'd seen combat. They'd won victories. They weren't easily frightened. But what they'd witnessed at Myeongnyang wasn't combat. It was execution. 31 ships destroyed in 2.5 hours. 3,000 men dead. And the Koreans had done it with 9 vessels while taking minimal casualties. Japanese chronicles written after the battle describe the defeat in apocalyptic terms. One account calls it, quote, 18. Another writes that, quote, 19. A third describes Todo Takatora returning to base, quote, 20. These weren't exaggerations. They were attempts to rationalize the impossible. Think about what this retreat meant strategically. The Japanese fleet had been assembled specifically to secure naval supremacy along Korea's southern coast. Their orders were clear. Destroy the remaining Korean naval forces, establish supply lines for the land invasion, transport reinforcements north. They'd entered the battle with 130 ships, overwhelming force. They left with 99 damaged vessels, shattered morale, and the absolute certainty that engaging Yi Sun-sin again would be suicide. By 1:30 p.m., the last Japanese ship had disappeared over the southern horizon. Yi Sun-sin, standing on his flagship's deck, watched them go. His officers were exhausted, stunned, unable to fully process what they'd just survived. One captain reportedly asked, "Admiral, should we pursue?" Yi shook his head. "We've done what needed doing. Let them run. Let them tell their commanders what happens when they sail against Korea." Here's what the Japanese didn't understand yet. Myeongnyang wasn't just a tactical defeat. It was strategic catastrophe. With their navy broken and refusing to engage, Japanese land forces in Korea were cut off from resupply. The invasion that had seemed unstoppable 3 months ago was now trapped, starving and facing inevitable retreat. But the cost of victory was about to become clear. Yi's fleet had fought for over 3 hours at maximum intensity. Damage reports were coming in. Ammunition was exhausted. And the human toll, what the battle had taken from 330 men who'd faced 10,000, was only beginning to surface. When the tide slackened and the current calmed, Yi Sun-sin surveyed the battlefield. Korean casualties. Fewer than 20 men killed, approximately 40 wounded. 2 ships had sustained moderate damage. Every other vessel was intact and combat ready. Japanese casualties: 13,000 confirmed dead. 31 warships completely destroyed. Another dozen damaged beyond repair. The strait was choked with debris. Splintered wood, bodies, pieces of armor, torn sails. The water was so thick with corpses that Korean crews had difficulty rowing through them. This wasn't just a victory. It was a mathematical absurdity. The kill ratio was 650 to 1. Yi had achieved what no military textbook said was possible. He'd held a defensive position against an enemy 14 times his strength and inflicted 98% casualties while sustaining less than 2% of his own force. At 2 p.m., Korean crews began the grim work of assessing damage and tending wounded. The 2 damaged ships had taken multiple cannon hits, but remained seaworthy. Carpenters were already patching holes, replacing shattered planking. The wounded, 40 men suffering from everything from arrow wounds to burns from fire arrows, were moved to Yi's flagship, where the ship's surgeon worked with limited medical supplies. Most would survive. The 19 dead were wrapped in sailcloth for burial at sea with full military honors. Then there was the water itself. Contemporary accounts describe the Myeongnyang Strait after the battle as resembling a graveyard more than a waterway. Hundreds of bodies floated in the current, drifting north with the tide. Pieces of ships, masts, hull fragments, torn rigging, created floating obstacles. Armor and weapons glinted beneath the surface. The smell of death and seawater filled the air. Korean sailors, rowing through the debris field, had to push corpses aside with their oars. Some men vomited from the horror of it. Others simply stared in numb silence. Here's what makes these casualty figures so staggering when you break them down. 13,000 Japanese dead from an initial attacking force of approximately 10,300 means the actual casualty rate exceeded 100%. Some Japanese ships from the rear formations attempted to enter the battle after the vanguard was destroyed and were also sunk. Think about that. The killing was so efficient that Japanese reinforcements died before they could even engage. Yi Sun-sin walked the deck of his flagship, stopping to speak with crew members, checking on the wounded, observing repairs. According to accounts from officers present, Yi showed no triumph, no celebration. He understood what they'd accomplished was unprecedented, but he also understood the cost. 19 Korean sailors had died defending their nation. Their families would receive no compensation. Their names would be recorded in naval archives, but most would be forgotten by history. Only Yi's name would be remembered. At 3 p.m., Yi assembled his captains. They gathered on the flagship's deck, exhausted men who'd survived impossible odds through a combination of Yi's genius, their own courage, and physics. Yi's words, recorded by multiple sources, were characteristically brief. "You fought well. Your nation will not forget this day. Now rest. Repair your ships. Care for your wounded. The Japanese will not return soon, but they will return eventually. We must be ready." But here's what Yi didn't tell his captains. The battle at Myeongnyang had saved Korea's navy and broken Japan's southern offensive. However, the war was far from over. Japanese land forces still occupied 2/3 of the peninsula, and Yi Sun-sin, having proved what 9 ships could accomplish with the right commander, would spend the next 14 months fighting an enemy that now feared him more than death itself. The Battle of Myeongnyang ended Japan's naval dominance in Korean waters forever. After the defeat, Japanese commanders never again attempted a major naval offensive. Their supply lines remained vulnerable. Their land forces, unable to receive reinforcements or provisions by sea, bogged down in central Korea and eventually retreated. The war dragged on until 1598, when Toyotomi Hideyoshi died, and Japan withdrew from the peninsula entirely. Yi Sun-sin fought his last battle at Myeongnyang on December 16, 1598, where he was killed by a stray bullet, but not before his fleet destroyed another 50 Japanese warships. Korea survived as an independent nation because one man refused to retreat when retreat made perfect sense. 9 ships held a strait. 1 admiral broke an empire. And history would remember Myeongnyang as the moment when genius, geography, and absolute courage proved that numbers don't mean a damn thing when the right man commands the right position at the right time. The strategic consequences were immediate and catastrophic for Japan. Within 2 weeks of Myeongnyang, Japanese commanders abandoned plans for their northern offensive. Supply convoys that were supposed to support land forces never sailed. Captains refused to risk encountering Yi's fleet. Japanese armies occupying central Korea began rationing food. By January 1598, they were starving. Soldiers deserted. Morale collapsed. The invasion that had seemed unstoppable 6 years earlier was dying from logistical strangulation. Here's what the chronicles don't tell you. Myeongnyang didn't just save Korea's navy. It saved Korea's ability to resist. If Yi had retreated or been destroyed on October 26th, Japanese forces would have controlled the entire southern coast by November. Seoul would have fallen by December. The war would have ended with Japanese victory and Korean subjugation. Instead, 9 ships held a strait for 3 hours, and an entire invasion died. Think about those numbers one more time. 9 ships, 330 men, against 130 warships and 10,000 enemies. The odds were 14 to 1. The kill ratio was 650 to 1. Yi Sun-sin achieved what military historians still struggle to explain. A defensive victory so complete that the attacking force was essentially annihilated, while the defenders sustained casualties barely reaching 5%. Why rebuilt Korea's fleet over the next 14 months? By December 1598, he commanded 133 warships, the largest Korean fleet in history. When Toyotomi Hideyoshi died in September 1598 and Japan ordered full withdrawal, Yi intercepted the retreating fleet at Myeongnyang Strait. The battle lasted through the night. 50 Japanese ships were destroyed. Korean casualties were minimal, except for 1. At approximately 4 a.m. on December 16th, 1598, Admiral Yi Sun-sin was struck by a stray arquebus bullet fired from a fleeing Japanese vessel. The wound was mortal. Yi's last words, recorded by his nephew Yi Wan, were orders. "The battle is at its height. Do not announce my death. Beat my war drums. Do not let the men know I have fallen." He died minutes later. His officers followed his command. They dressed his body in his armor, propped it upright, and continued beating the war drums. The fleet fought on, believing Yi still commanded. They won. Japan's withdrawal became a rout. Korea survived. The nation that had been on the brink of extinction in 1597 remained independent because one admiral understood that courage, preparation, and tactical brilliance could overcome any numerical disadvantage. Yi Sun-sin never lost a naval battle. 23 engagements before his disgrace. Myeongnyang, Myeongnyang, 25 battles, 25 victories, 0 defeats. He died undefeated and saved his nation in the process. That's not legend, that's history. And it started with 9 ships, a narrow strait, and a man who refused to run when everyone said running was the only rational choice.